The year was 1941 and the world was burning. Europe lay in ruins beneath the shadow of the swastika, its cities gutted by bombs, its people haunted by the sound of marching boots. The air itself seemed poisoned by smoke and fear. But far above the scorched earth, another kind of war raged, a war of wings, speed, and skill, where death came not from trenches, but from the sky itself. The Royal Air Force had held the line before, but the Luftwaffe was back, stronger and hungrier than ever. Over the battered airfields of southern England, men too young to drink legally climbed into aircraft that looked as worn and tired as they were. The Hurricanes and Spitfires were patched together from scrap, their wings scarred by the ghosts of earlier fights. Among them was Sergeant Thomas "Tommy" Calloway, a quiet gunner with a reputation that sat somewhere between unlucky and cursed. Tommy was no hero, at least not the kind who appeared on recruiting posters. He had the look of a man used to being overlooked. Short, wiry, his jaw shadowed with permanent stubble, his uniform always smelling of oil and cordite. But he was steady, the kind of soldier who didn't shake under fire, who didn't boast in the mess hall. He spoke little, but his actions carried weight. His aircraft, a Hawker Hurricane, was infamous among the crew for one thing: a cracked gun scope. A single fracture split the glass across the middle, distorting the view like a spiderweb. The others laughed about it constantly. "Calloway's flying blind," they'd say. "He couldn't hit the side of a barn with that thing." Tommy would just smile faintly, check his ammunition and go back to work. He didn't need their approval. The sky was the only judge that mattered. The morning of his fateful mission was cold and colourless. Fog rolled across the airfield like smoke from an invisible fire, curling around the grounded aircraft. Mechanics worked in silence, their hands blackened with grease, their faces drawn from too many sleepless nights. When the alert siren wailed, every man moved with grim precision. The Luftwaffe was coming, a formation of Heinkel bombers with fighter escort, heading straight for the coast. Within minutes, the Hurricanes and Spitfires roared to life, engines coughing before settling into a steady growl. Tommy climbed into his cockpit, the leather seat cold beneath him, his breath visible in the morning chill. He tapped the photograph taped beside his throttle, his younger brother Peter smiling in RAF blue. Peter had been shot down 2 months earlier over Calais. No wreckage was ever found. The silence of his brother's absence was louder than any siren. "Red Squadron, form up! Eyes sharp, lads!" came the order over the radio. The wheels left the earth, and the Hurricanes rose into the sky, slicing through the mist. Below them, England fell away, a patchwork of fields and rivers fading into memory. Above, the clouds opened into a cold, blinding expanse. The squadron tightened formation. Then in the far distance, the enemy appeared, dark dots against the rising sun, moving in perfect mechanical order. The call came through, sharp and steady. "Contact, 12 o'clock high." The first explosion of gunfire tore the sky apart. The serenity of dawn was shattered by chaos. Tracer rounds streaked across the air like fireflies from hell. Engines screamed, and smoke trails tangled in the clouds. Tommy gritted his teeth as the Hurricane jolted violently. The crack in his scope refracted the light into strange patterns, but he didn't need it to know the truth. The Luftwaffe was everywhere. He dove through a swarm of fighters, his machine guns rattling, empty shells flying past his canopy. The air reeked of oil and cordite, the sound of bullets tearing through aluminum filling his ears. A flash of silver passed to his left. A Messerschmitt, so close he could see the pilot's goggles. Tommy fired instinctively. The rounds missed by inches. The German banked away, his engine roaring like a beast. The radio crackled with chaos. "They're on me! I can't—" The voice cut off in static. Tommy glanced right in time to see Jenkins, his wingman, erupt in a burst of flame. The Hurricane spun downward, vanishing into the clouds below. There was no parachute, no second chance. For a heartbeat, Tommy froze, his chest tightening. Then instinct took over. He rolled, dove, climbed, anything to stay alive. A burst of gunfire struck his tail, the metal screaming in protest, his cockpit filled with the stench of burning oil. He ducked behind a wall of cloud, the grey mist swallowing him whole. Inside the fog, everything was silent, except for the hum of his engine and the ragged sound of his own breathing. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from adrenaline. When he burst out of the cloud bank, the sky had changed. Smoke trails everywhere, planes burning, fragments of wings drifting downward like dead leaves. The radio was silent now. He was alone. Then he saw it, a Heinkel bomber limping across the sky, trailing thick smoke from its right engine. It was nearly 2 miles away, far beyond the effective range of a clean scope, let alone a broken one. Logic said it was hopeless, but logic had no place up here. He steadied the controls, forcing his heartbeat to slow. Through the cracked glass, the bomber looked split in two, its image doubled and ghost-like. He ignored the fracture, focusing on what he felt rather than what he saw. He thought of Peter, of the laughter in the mess hall that morning, of the way the others had called him blind. The crack didn't matter. He lined up the shot by instinct and fired. The Hurricane shuddered from the recoil, and the tracer rounds arced across the sky, long glowing lines vanishing into the distance. For a second, nothing. Then the bomber's wing erupted in flame. The Heinkel jerked sideways, its engines coughing smoke, before the aircraft began to spiral downward. Tommy's eyes widened. It had been an impossible shot, 2 miles out, through a shattered sight. Yet it had found its mark. "Bloody hell," he whispered, his voice swallowed by the engine's roar. He didn't have time to process what he'd done. Another fighter dove toward him from above, guns blazing. Bullets tore past his canopy, sparks flying as rounds hit the fuselage. He rolled sharply, the G-forces crushing him into his seat. The Messerschmitt overshot, looping up for another attack. Tommy banked, lined up again, and squeezed the trigger. His guns thundered. The German fighter burst into flame, breaking apart in mid-air before crashing into the channel below. The sudden quiet that followed felt unreal. The smell of smoke and hot metal clung to the air. Tommy's hands were slick with sweat, his heartbeat echoing in his ears. His plane was riddled with holes, his fuel gauge dipping dangerously low, but the engine still held. The radio came alive at last. Static, then a faint voice. "Red 3, do you copy? Do you read?" He pressed the switch. "This is Calloway, still airborne." The voice returned, strained but clear. "Status?" "Damaged, returning to base." "Copy that. Bring her home, lad." He turned for home, the coastline of England barely visible through the haze of battle. Below him, the sea was scattered with burning wrecks, friend and foe alike. Black smoke rose like funeral pyres into the morning sky. Tommy didn't look away. Each plume represented someone he'd shared breakfast with hours ago. The wind howled through the holes in his fuselage as if whispering their names. When the airfield finally came into view, he felt no triumph, just exhaustion, just silence. As he descended through the clouds, the broken scope glinted in the sunlight, a reminder of every jeer, every dismissal. They had laughed at it, they had laughed at him. But that shattered glass had seen further than anyone else that day. It had cut through chaos and found its mark. He touched the cracked lens once with his gloved hand, and exhaled slowly. The battle was over, but the war was not. The skies above Europe would burn again before this was done. And when they did, Sergeant Thomas Calloway would be waiting, the gunner with the broken scope, the man who could see what others could not. The storm had only begun. The engines of the Hurricane screamed as they tore through the dawn sky. The channel glimmered below like a mirror cracked by the chaos above it. Smoke trailed across the horizon, the remnants of the morning's first clash. Sergeant Tommy Calloway's hands were tight on the controls, his knuckles white beneath his gloves, The storm he'd survived had left its scars, bullet holes along the wings, a leaking fuel line, and the acrid stench of burnt oil in the cockpit. But the mission wasn't over. The Luftwaffe was regrouping, and reports from command said another wave was already crossing the French coast. They were coming again, heavier and faster. The British radar picked them up like a swarm of hornets. At base, the ground crew scrambled. Mechanics with oil-streaked faces refueled and rearmed what little was left of Red Squadron. Out of 12 planes, 5 had returned. Of those, only 3 could fly again. The rest were mangled wrecks, their pilots gone, their names already being written onto casualty boards that grew longer every day. The laughter that usually echoed across the hangar was gone. The men spoke in short, flat sentences. War had stripped the romance out of flying. Now it was only survival. Tommy sat on a wooden crate outside his Hurricane, running a rag over his gun sight. Still cracked, still mocked, yet now a symbol of something defiant. His mechanic, Corporal Hensley, approached with a cigarette hanging from his lip. "They say you hit a Heinkel from 2 miles out," he said, disbelief buried beneath fatigue. Tommy didn't look up. "It was luck," he muttered. "No such thing," Hensley replied, lighting his cigarette. "Not up there." The order came less than an hour later. "Scramble, scramble, scramble!" The second wave was inbound, a formation of over 100 aircraft. Tommy climbed back into the cockpit, the familiar vibrations running through his body as the engine came alive. The sky was a pale blue when he took off, but he could already see the distant flicker of sunlight glinting off enemy wings. His heart pounded, but his face stayed still. There was no room for fear anymore, not after what he'd seen. The radio filled with chatter, voices tight with nerves. "Keep formation, don't break unless ordered," came the command. They climbed higher, the earth shrinking below them, until the clouds became their battlefield once again. Then they saw them, a black river of bombers stretching across the horizon, flanked by Messerschmitts in tight formation. It was an army in the sky. The moment the two sides clashed, the air turned to madness. Tracer rounds tore through the morning light. Explosions bloomed like fireflowers, and the radio erupted with frantic calls. "Break left, he's on you! I'm hit, I'm hit!" The sky was a storm of death, and Tommy was in its heart. He dove straight into the enemy formation, his guns roaring, the Hurricane rattling from the recoil. Through the fractured scope, he picked out the silhouette of a bomber, its nose glinting in the sun, its payload aimed straight for London. He lined it up, trusting his instinct more than the glass, and fired. The first burst tore through the fuselage, the second ignited the payload. The explosion was blinding. Flames engulfed the sky, and the shockwave rocked his plane like a toy in a hurricane. He pulled away, coughing from the smoke that seeped into the cockpit. The smell of burning fuel clawed at his throat. Behind him, the bomber spiraled downward in a trail of fire. But before relief could set in, a Messerschmitt dropped in from above, its cannons spitting fire. Bullets ripped through his left wing. Warning lights flashed across his dashboard. "He's on me!" Tommy shouted into the radio, but no answer came. Only static. He dove, spinning toward the clouds, bullets chasing him like angry hornets. The enemy stayed glued to his tail. He could feel the plane trembling under the stress, every rivet screaming. The altimeter spun as he dropped below the clouds, his vision blurred by G-force and smoke. At the last second, he leveled out over the sea, the surface so close he could see the waves splitting beneath his wake. The Messerschmitt followed, pushing its limits, chasing him down into the mist. Tommy gritted his teeth. He jerked the throttle back, slowing just enough for the enemy to overshoot. The German shot past, close enough that Tommy could see the insignia on the tail. He aimed, the cracked scope aligning on instinct, and fired. The rounds tore through the Messerschmitt's canopy. The enemy plane flipped violently, then plunged into the channel in a burst of spray. "That's for Jenkins," Tommy growled, his voice shaking. The radio finally crackled back to life. "Red 3, report!" "Still in the air," Tommy replied, his breathing ragged. "Low on ammo, low on fuel." "Copy that, Red 3. Fall back toward Dover." But Tommy hesitated. He looked up. More bombers were breaking through, heading inland. He could see them clearly now, their shadows sliding across the white cliffs. London wasn't far. If they made it through, the cost would be unimaginable. He tightened his grip on the controls. "Negative, Command. I'm staying in." The reply was instant, panicked. "Red 3, that's an order." "Tell the order to wait," Tommy cut in, cutting the transmission. He pushed the throttle forward, the hurricane straining as it climbed back into the fight. The sky over the coast was chaos. Anti-aircraft fire blossomed from below, black puffs bursting among the bombers. Flak shells screamed upward, shaking the heavens. Tommy flew straight through it, weaving between explosions. The turbulence slammed him against the seat, but he held steady. Another bomber lined up in his sights. He fired a long burst, his last belt of ammunition, the tracers stitching a path across the sky. The Heinkel's wing caught fire, breaking off mid-air. For a moment it looked like a wounded bird. Then it fell, disintegrating into the sea below. But Tommy's luck was running out. The hurricane jolted violently, had the engine sputtering, coughing black smoke. A warning alarm screamed. He glanced at the gauges. The oil pressure was dropping fast. Then the voice of reality returned in his head. The fight was over. His plane wasn't going to last much longer. He turned for home, the coastline a faint line beneath the smoke-filled horizon. The roar of battle faded behind him, replaced by the rhythmic cough of a dying engine. Minutes stretched like hours. Every vibration felt like the end. The fuel gauge dropped below empty, and the propeller began to stutter. Tommy's mind flickered through memories. Peter's laughter, Jenkins' final scream, the look on Hensley's face that morning. He wondered if anyone would ever remember their names. His hands trembled as he guided the hurricane lower. The white cliffs came into view, the airfield just beyond them, but he knew he wouldn't make it. The engine seized with a deafening bang. The propeller stopped. Silence. He was gliding now, powerless, the wind whistling through the bullet holes in the fuselage. He spotted a stretch of open field below and angled toward it. The ground rose fast. He gritted his teeth and braced for impact. The landing was violent. The hurricane slammed down hard, the undercarriage collapsing, the plane skidding across the earth in a trail of smoke and dirt. Metal screamed, glass shattered, and then everything stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Tommy's vision blurred, his head spinning. He reached up, unlatched the canopy, and stumbled out into the open air. Smoke curled from the wreck behind him. His legs gave way, and he dropped to his knees, breathing hard, the smell of burnt fuel and grass filling his lungs. In the distance, he could still hear the faint rumble of the battle overhead. The sky was a swirling tapestry of black smoke and orange flame. He stared up at it, the enormity of it all pressing down on him. The laughter, the jeers, the endless noise. None of it mattered now. All that remained was the fight. A jeep rattled across the field toward him. Medics and ground crew jumped out, shouting his name. "You're alive, Calloway! Bloody hell, we thought you were done for!" He barely heard them. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, where smoke still rose over the channel. He knew he'd be sent back up soon. Repairs would be made, new ammo loaded, and the sky would call him again. He felt the weight of it, the endless cycle of death and duty. And yet beneath that weight, something still burned in him. The crack in his scope had become more than a flaw. It was a mark of endurance, of defiance. That night, as he sat alone outside the barracks, the distant echo of anti-aircraft fire rolled across the countryside. The stars above were faint behind the haze of smoke. He took the cracked scope from his pocket, removed during the repair work, and turned it over in his hands. It reflected the firelight in jagged patterns like lightning frozen in glass. He smiled faintly. "You and me again tomorrow," he murmured. Then he slipped it into his flight jacket, the same place where Peter's photograph used to be. The next mission would come soon, and when it did, Tommy Calloway, the gunner with the broken scope, would be waiting to climb back into the storm. The autumn of 1941 bled into winter with no mercy. England's skies were never truly quiet, only shifting shades of violence. Some days it came in the form of sirens and falling bombs, other days in the whine of engines far above the clouds. The Luftwaffe had begun changing tactics, sending smaller, faster groups of fighters deep into British territory to cripple morale and destroy what was left of the RAF's airfields. For men like Sergeant Thomas Calloway, it meant one thing: no rest. The airfield at Hawkinge had become both home and graveyard. Burnt-out fuselages lined the edges of the tarmac, blackened and skeletal. Mechanics worked around the clock under tarpaulins and floodlights, piecing together aircraft from whatever scraps remained. The men moved like ghosts, faces pale from exhaustion, eyes hollow from what they'd seen. Every dawn felt borrowed. Calloway stood beside his newly patched Hurricane, its once sleek frame now riddled with weld marks and mismatched paint. His hands rested on the cool metal, feeling the faint vibration of life as the engine was tested. It wasn't just a machine anymore, it was a partner in survival. Corporal Hensley walked up behind him, carrying 2 tin mugs of coffee. "You hear about Squadron 82? He asked quietly. Calloway shook his head. "Didn't make it back. Whole lot of them. Caught over Dieppe." Hensley's voice trailed off, heavy with the kind of silence that came from too many bad reports. Calloway nodded slowly, staring at the horizon. The fog was thick that morning, rolling in from the channel like a living thing. "Then we fly for them," he said softly. Hensley handed him the mug and managed a tired grin. "Aye, for them." That afternoon, the order came down: reconnaissance patrol over the French coast. The brass wanted eyes on a suspected build-up near Calais, possibly preparations for another bombing run. It was a suicide flight in all but name. The Luftwaffe controlled the air over northern France, and every pilot knew it. Still, Calloway volunteered without hesitation. He'd stopped counting the number of times he'd climbed into his Hurricane, thinking it would be the last. Each time he survived, it felt less like luck and more like debt. The takeoff was rough, the runway slick with frost, the wind slicing across the field. The squadron formed up over the channel, 6 Hurricanes flying low to avoid detection. The sea below was steel grey and endless. The radio was quiet, the only sound the hum of engines and the faint hiss of static. As they crossed into enemy airspace, Calloway felt the familiar tension knotting in his stomach. Every shadow in the clouds looked like a threat. Every glint of sunlight could be the reflection of an enemy's wings. Then, out of the haze, they saw it. The French coastline, scarred by bomb craters and dotted with anti-aircraft batteries. Smoke drifted from the ruins of Calais. It looked dead, yet alive in its destruction. The squadron spread out, scanning for movement. Calloway's voice came through the radio, calm and clipped. "Keep tight! Eyes open!" They swept inland, cameras clicking, the mission routine, but dangerous. That's when the warning came. "Bandits! 3 o'clock high!" The shout crackled through the radio, and before anyone could respond, tracer fire ripped through the formation. The sky erupted. Messerschmitts dove from above, their guns lighting up the grey clouds. The first Hurricane disintegrated in mid-air, fragments spinning like shrapnel. Calloway banked hard, the G-force pressing him into his seat. His engine roared in protest. He climbed steeply, rolling just as a stream of bullets passed where he'd been seconds earlier. The air was thick with fire and smoke. "Break! Break!" shouted the squadron leader, but the order was lost in the chaos. The formation was gone. Calloway found himself alone again, the one constant of war. A Messerschmitt streaked past his canopy, the black cross flashing by like a scar. He dove after it, his guns rattling, the cracked scope flickering with light. The rounds missed wide. The German pilot rolled left, taunting him, staying just out of reach. Calloway gritted his teeth, following through the dive. The air screamed around him, the altimeter spinning downward. He pulled the trigger again. This time, the tracers connected. The Messerschmitt jerked violently, smoke trailing from its engine. It tumbled toward the ground, vanishing behind a wall of cloud. He scanned the landscape below, fields, woods, and the distant shimmer of a river. He had seconds to decide. Pulling back on the stick, he aimed for an open stretch of land between two hills. The hurricane glided in, barely holding altitude. The ground came up fast. The impact was brutal. A plane skipped once, twice, then plowed into the earth. Metal screamed. The canopy shattered. When the dust settled, Calloway was alive, bruised and bleeding, but alive. He forced the canopy open, the cold air biting at his skin. The smell of burning oil filled his lungs. He staggered into the open field, his legs shaky beneath him. Somewhere far off he could hear shouting, German voices, patrols. He grabbed his revolver and the small map folded in his jacket. The crash would draw attention fast. He had to move. Using the smoke as cover, he limped toward the nearby woods. Every step sent pain shooting up his leg, but stopping wasn't an option. The forest swallowed him whole. Branches clawed at his flight suit, mud sucking at his boots. Behind him, the faint sound of engines and shouting grew louder. They were searching. He pressed on, deeper into the trees. Time lost meaning. He followed the faint glimmer of moonlight filtering through the branches, every breath a struggle. When he finally collapsed beside a fallen log, exhaustion overtook him. His eyes fluttered shut, the echo of war still ringing in his ears. He woke to voices, soft, urgent, and in English. Blinking through the fog of pain, he saw two faces above him, a man and a woman, both in worn civilian clothes. "You're RAF," the man said, his French accent thick. "We saw the crash." Calloway nodded weakly. "Name's Calloway." The woman handed him a canteen. "You're lucky we found you first," she whispered. "The Germans are combing the woods." They helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as they led him through the forest. They belonged to the French resistance. Ordinary people turned warriors in the shadows. Their safe house was hidden in the ruins of an old farmhouse, its windows blacked out, its cellar lined with maps and radios. Calloway could hardly believe it. An underground network right beneath the Germans' noses. They gave him food, bandaged his wounds, and listened as he explained his situation. The leader, a man called Marcel, nodded grimly. "We can get you to the coast. There's a boat leaving for Dover in 2 nights, but you'll have to move at night. Too dangerous otherwise." For the first time in weeks, Calloway slept without the sound of engines overhead. The cellar was cold and damp, but it felt safer than any airfield. Still, his dreams were restless. Fragments of fire, falling planes, and his brother's voice calling through the static. When dawn broke, he awoke to distant gunfire. The resistance had drawn attention. The Germans were sweeping nearby villages. Marcel burst into the cellar. "They know someone survived the crash. We have to move now." The escape was a blur of motion. They slipped through back roads and forests, guided by locals risking their lives. At every checkpoint, Calloway saw the enemy up close. Soldiers laughing, smoking, unaware that the man they hunted was only meters away. Each step toward the coast felt heavier. The war wasn't just fought in the sky. It lived here, in the fear of those who resisted in silence. By the time they reached the cliffs overlooking the channel, night had fallen. The sea below was black and endless. A small fishing boat waited in the cove, its engine off, its silhouette barely visible. "This is it," Marcel said. "Once you're across, tell them. France still fights." Calloway clasped his hand, the gratitude unspoken. "You'll be remembered," he said. Marcel smiled sadly. "If anyone remembers at all." As the boat pulled away, the wind carried the faint echo of gunfire behind them. Calloway looked back once, seeing the dark outline of the French coast fading into shadow. Ahead lay England, battered, burning but still standing. He tightened his coat against the cold, the cracked scope still tucked in his pocket. It had survived another fall. So had he. But both bore the marks of a war that refused to end. The sea was rough, the crossing slow and silent. Each wave felt like a heartbeat, each gust of wind a whisper of the dead. When the faint lights of Dover finally appeared on the horizon, Calloway exhaled for the first time in hours. He was home, but he knew home would never be the same. The tide had turned, but the storm was far from over. The wind that rolled off the channel that winter carried the ghosts of 1,000 stories. For Sergeant Thomas Calloway, it was the same wind that had once filled his wings, the same salt-tinged air that smelled of oil, cordite, and courage. But now the sky that had once burned with war was calm, deceptively so. England had survived the onslaught of 1941, but victory was a fragile illusion. Cities lay in ruins, families huddled in shelters, and the pilots who had defended the nation carried invisible scars deeper than any bullet wound. When Calloway returned to Hawkinge Airfield, the place felt both familiar and foreign. The hangars were half rebuilt after bombings, the runways patched and blackened. Many of the faces he knew were gone. Jenkins, Harris, the quiet mechanic who always whistled before takeoff. Their names lived only on weathered notice boards inside the mess hall. He walked the length of the tarmac, his boots crunching on frost, and felt the weight of memory pressing on his chest. The sky above him stretched wide and pale, empty of aircraft for the first time in months. It felt wrong, a silence too deep to trust. Inside the hangar, Corporal Hensley was hunched over an engine block, his sleeves rolled up, hands black with grease. When he saw Calloway, he froze for a second, then broke into a grin that barely masked emotion. "You bloody stubborn bastard," he said, voice rough. "Didn't think I'd see you again." Calloway managed a tired smile. "Neither did I." Hensley laughed once, sharp and hollow. "Heard you were dead. Word was you went down over France." Calloway shrugged. "Almost did. Got a lift home." Hensley gestured to a corner of the hangar, where the remains of Calloway's Hurricane sat stripped and battered. "She's done for. But we kept the scope." The cracked lens sat on a workbench, glinting faintly in the weak winter light. Calloway reached out and turned it over in his hand. The fracture line caught the glow like a scar of glass lightning. It had been with him through everything, through fire, through falling skies, through survival. He placed it gently back down. "Let it rest," he said quietly. "She's earned it." The war dragged on, but the Battle of Britain had shifted. The RAF, battered but unbroken, began to claw back control of the skies. Every sortie, every mission carried the weight of those who'd fallen before. Calloway flew again, though each flight felt different now. More deliberate, more haunted. He was no longer chasing glory or vengeance. He flew to protect what was left. Each time his plane lifted from the runway, he carried the memory of those who never took off again. By 1943, the tide had turned across Europe. Allied bombers began striking deep into German territory. New planes filled the airfields, faster, deadlier machines of war. The young pilots arriving now were fresh-faced and eager, unaware of the price their predecessors had paid. Calloway, older and wearier, found himself in a new role: instructor, mentor, storyteller. He stood before rows of recruits, his uniform faded, his eyes sharp but tired. "You think flying is about skill?" he told them, his voice steady. "It isn't. It's about nerve. It's about surviving the moment when everything around you says you won't." The recruits listened, some in awe, others skeptical. He didn't blame them. They hadn't seen what he had: the sky turning red over Dover, the sea swallowing burning wrecks, the sound of a man's final scream cut short by static. They'd been born into a war that was already halfway won, and they believed in its end. Calloway hoped they were right. He envied them for it. One night, after a long day of training flights, he walked alone along the cliffs overlooking the channel. The sea below was dark and restless, the horizon lost in mist. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the cracked scope, which he had never truly parted with. Turning it toward the stars, he stared through the split glass. The fracture distorted the view, scattering the light into fragments. It looked like the sky itself was broken, beautiful, and ruined all at once. "Peter," he whispered into the wind, "you'd have liked it tonight. Clear skies." He had carried his brother's memory like a compass since that first mission. Every shot fired, every dive, every desperate flight had been guided by it. Peter had vanished into the fog of war, one of thousands whose graves were never found. But in that moment, standing on the cliff's edge, Calloway realized something. He'd spent the war chasing ghosts, trying to find meaning in the chaos. Maybe the meaning wasn't in victory or vengeance. Maybe it was simply in surviving, in refusing to let the darkness take everything. The next morning brought new orders. Escort duty for a bomber formation heading toward occupied France. It was supposed to be routine, minimal resistance expected, but the war had a way of punishing assumptions. Halfway across the channel, the Germans found them. The sky exploded into chaos once more. Tracers ripped through the clouds, engines roared, and the formation broke apart. Calloway's squadron fought to hold the line as bombers scattered. The radio buzzed with shouts and static. "We've got Focke-Wulfs incoming. Keep them off the bombers." Calloway rolled into the fight, his Hurricane shaking as rounds flew past. The enemy came fast, sleek, black fighters cutting through the formation like blades. He fired short bursts, diving and climbing, the rhythm of battle flowing through muscle memory. One of the bombers was hit, flames trailing from its engines. The crew bailed out, parachutes opening against the smoke. Calloway swung around to cover them, firing at an enemy closing in. His rounds connected. The German plane burst into flame and spiraled away. But in the next second, his world shattered. A burst of cannon fire struck his wing, tearing through the fuel line. The explosion ripped across the fuselage, and fire surged along the side of his cockpit. "Mayday! Red 3 hit! Losing control!" His voice cracked through the radio. He fought the stick, but the plane was dying, spinning toward the sea. Flames filled his vision. He pulled the canopy release and ejected, the wind slamming into him like a hammer. The ocean swallowed him in cold darkness. For a moment he couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The weight of his gear dragged him down. He kicked hard, breaking the surface, gasping for air. Around him, debris floated, the remains of his Hurricane. The sky above was chaos, flashes of fire and smoke. A bomber passed overhead, limping home. Then the sound faded. Silence returned, broken only by the hiss of waves. Hours passed before a British rescue boat found him, half conscious, clutching the cracked scope in his hand. Even sinking, he hadn't let it go. When they pulled him aboard, he was pale, soaked and shaking, but alive. Barely. He spent weeks in recovery, his body mending slower than his mind. The doctors called him lucky. He called it survival. The same word he'd been living by since the first day he'd taken flight. When he finally returned to duty, it wasn't to the cockpit. His flying days were done. The war would continue without him, and he had to make peace with that. Years later, when peace finally came, the airfields went quiet. The Hurricanes were retired, the hangars emptied. The country began to rebuild piece by piece. Calloway stayed in the RAF until the early 1950s, training young pilots who would never know the desperation of those first battles. When he finally left, he took one thing with him: the cracked scope. He kept it on his mantle at home, a reminder not of victory, but of endurance. In time, the world forgot the names of men like Calloway. Their stories faded into history books and memorial walls. Yet, for those who looked closely, their legacy was everywhere, in the peace that filled the once burning skies, in the freedom of the generations that followed. On the last night of his life, decades later, Thomas Calloway sat by his window, overlooking the quiet English countryside. The air was still, the stars bright. On the table beside him rested the cracked scope, its fracture catching the lamplight. He lifted it one final time, looking through the break in the glass. The stars scattered, broken, yet beautiful. He smiled faintly. "Clear skies, Peter," he whispered. Then, closing his eyes, he let the silence take him. The next morning, they found him still in his chair, the cracked scope resting in his open hand. The war had ended long ago, but its echoes lived on, in every quiet dawn, In every breath of wind across the channel, men like Calloway had fought not for glory, but so that others could live in peace. Their courage had written the history the world stood upon. They had been laughed at, doubted, dismissed, until they proved what true vision meant. Because sometimes it's the broken glass that sees the furthest. Until next time, stay safe and see you in the next history video.